audience, they're here, they're ready, and we'll talk now about what we're going to do. So it's the plan for today is the following. We're going to do 3 very short sort of presentations covering very specific sort of areas. So we're actually going to start, Claudiana is going to talk a little bit about what I think is probably the most prevalent type of central bank communication research, which is the sort of research and how that research then impacts, in particular, financial markets, whether it be monetary policy or financial stability. And she'll talk about some of her research, some of the research we've seen the last few days. Then Michael will go next, and he will talk about this somewhat newer, but now very prevalent area of how central banks can actually realistically communicate with the general public, some of the directions of research, and again, talk about some of the different methodologies and things that we've seen here. And then I'll go last, and I'll talk about 2 things. One is I'll talk specifically about internal central bank communication, because the sort of deliberative process is actually weirdly how I ended up working on this topic of central bank communication a long time ago. I could tell you that origin story if you ever want. But then the other thing I'll talk a little bit about is that also some other techniques, like where we're going with large language models and text analysis and all these other developments. So that's the plan. The plan starts with you, Claudiana. So I don't know, I might move this over towards you. Do you want to take this over? You can have a mic. I hope it stretches. We're really precarious here. Can't actually know what I'll do. You can start it. While we're getting set up, I should just say to the audience, if you have questions as we go, just drop them in the Q&A, and I will monitor that and as appropriate, sort of chuck them to the speakers. But we'll also take questions in the room, so listen out for questions as well from there. Okay, over to you, Claudia.
Thanks a lot. So I think my task is a little bit easy, at least as a start, because I'm going to speak a bit about central bank communication and the part with financial markets. And we heard a lot these 2 days, but something that also already we knew, the good thing is that market listened to us and they react to us. And in these 2 days, we heard about 2 types of communication during the policy meeting days. So we heard about the information content of dissent that may have contain a signal, they might have an uncertainty effect for market reactions, but also other types of communication, again, during meeting days. But another thing that we are sort of moving, and it's quite a good development, we're moving towards communication out of meeting days or inter-meeting days. And this is important because we have a lot of this communication. So central banks are communicating a lot in inter-meeting days, and this is just an example of ECB and Eurosystem.
Stop sharing.
It says sharing.
Sorry. I just noticed on my screen. Stop sharing. Now share. Pick the window. This one. It was sharing the raw PowerPoint, not that. There you go. Sorry.
Okay. So this is depicting the number and the diversity of communication from ECB president, ECB executive board, or other NCB governors, comparing also with let's say the traditional communication that is on monetary policy events. Is the black line. And as you see, while we have, let's say, typically 12 and now 8 meetings per year, we have more than 100 communication events that are coming from let's say, other members, but also the ECB president, and coming in different forms, in speeches, parliament hearings. We're having also the accounts, NCB governors are also speaking. Now you might wonder why is this information important? We heard today that it is from if we look at speeches of the Bank of England. We know also for the Fed from previous research that market do react to this information. We looked at as well using this database that we created, and we also find that there are let's say, particular classes of financial, let's say, variables that are pretty reactive to communication that is coming in these intermeeting days. And this reaction is even greater than the reaction that these variables have on during government, let's say, governing council days. Here is just depicting the, let's say, the impact. This is the absolute, the mean absolute change around, let's say, speeches of the ECB president, executive board, and ECB and parliament hearing. And when we look at inflation linked swaps, so inflation expectations are reacting quite strongly to these events. Now the question is, okay, markets are reacting, but I think one question that we need to work more is, what are markets learning? So we see a reaction. We see that they might react to the tone, they might react to the topic, but what is this surprise? What are they learning? Are they learning about the objective? Typically, for these main central banks, the objective is pretty clear. So if we have an objective on inflation. So to what they are being surprised? Are they being surprised to the attention of the central bank to the objective? Because there might be times when the markets might think that, let's say, there is a low attention to a clear objective. Objective is clear, but there is not enough attention to the objective. Or are they learning about the reaction function, or the readiness to act, or policymakers' uncertainty? And finally, are they learning about information about the economy? I think this is important to, if we can disentangle of what markets are learning from this communication, and what are these surprises in effect? Are these shocks? Or are these actually, there is a particular type of information that it is important. And this is very important because when we move to the other part, which is communication when central banks are expanding their objectives. So we know that in the last years, so we were used with having clear objective on price stability, but as we showed these 2 days that even when we have strategic reviews that change the objective from, let's say, asymmetric to symmetric, so still being a 2, but asymmetric to symmetric, or changing the way how we reach the objective, let's say with an average targeting or another way, these changes are important. Now think about adding to this objective, other objectives like financial stability, climate change, inequality. And what is particular about these objectives or new objectives is that they are hard to quantify, they are hard to define. So in a sense, communication now it will become much more difficult from central banks, but also how market perceive these objectives, it will become also more, it will be, let's say, a new challenge for markets to disentangle the information from the communication. Then I have this quote. It's a summary of a quote from Alice in Wonderland, that if we don't have objectives, clear definitions, then it doesn't matter how we go there. So of course we don't know the reaction function. So if you don't know where we are going, any road will lead us there. So it means that there will be more and more uncertainty about the reaction function of the central bank. And I think then this will bring us back what I had read from the 70s, from the 80s, when Fed watchers were really reading the tea leaves of the Fed to understand not only the decision, but what was the objective, what they are paying attention to what they are reacting. So I think we are going back to those days when markets should sharpen the tea leaves reading of central bank communication, but us as researchers should sharpen as well these tools. And here I want to bring back again this communication in intermeeting days with speeches and other forms, because there I think there is still room to understand the topic or the objective that central banks are paying more attention to. So we did this attempt again with the same co-authors, Julia and Florence. We look at the Fed financial stability concerns for monetary policy decisions. The Fed, as you know, doesn't have financial stability as an objective. However, it's very, very often it appears into the discussion and the idea how should we learn if these concerns have some importance for monetary policy. And what we did was we looked at speeches of Federal Reserve. We looked at speeches of Fed chair, the board, regional Fed presidents, and to come up with topics of the main topics that they are covered in the speeches, and to come with a topic proportion on financial stability, but also a tone on financial stability. And we find that this topic proportion of financial stability, if you put it in a typical standard Taylor rule, actually it predicts the behavior of Fed funds rate beyond and above the usual variables that we have in this Taylor rule, the Green Book forecast for inflation or for output gap. So communication out of meeting days through speeches can inform us about the topic that is of interest at the time for, let's say, for central bankers. And we also find that it depends who's talking about the topic. So this is also informative. And with respect to the Fed, we found that regional Fed presidents, particularly, they have a signal of especially for the topic of financial stability. The idea is that if you see many of the policymakers speaking on one topic at the same time, that contains a signal of what is now the attention of the policymakers. And I would like to finish here, but the idea is that we have there's more challenges ahead of us with this enlargement of objective of central banks and the uncertainty that this is going to bring with respect to the reaction functions.
Perfect, thank you very much. Right, we'll save clapping to the end. So let me briefly stop sharing, get out of here. Yours is open here, is it? It's up here. Yeah. This one? Yeah. Control L. Now I'm going to do the same trick. Zoom is very sensitive to the idea that you go full screen before you. There you go, I think. Shows up there, shows up there.
Excellent, thanks a lot. Yeah, so Claudiana has been given the task to talk a little bit about the area where we've seen a lot of initial research on central bank communication, and I think also the area where central bankers are very comfortable. This is sort of their home turf, right? I mean, this is people we know, listen, people we think they understand, they have a lot of prior knowledge. We have high frequency data to actually see how central bank communications land with the financial markets. And I was now given the task to talk a little bit about central bank communication with the general public. That's sort of a rising area, both in terms of research and also in terms of practitioners. It is something that I think central banks have a strong desire to get into, but they also realize that, you know, there's still a lot to be learned here. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures to sort of set up the topics I want to raise for discussion here. This is one of them. We conducted a survey among former governing council members recently, and we asked them how they see the ECB's communication. And this here is a measure of adequacy. And you can see that they sort of said, you know, when the ECB communicates with financial markets or expert audiences, you know, things are pretty good. You know, the communication is adequate. But the general public, you know, there's clearly room for improvement here. So this is recognized by central bankers. It's also an area where central banks put in a lot of efforts and resources. So this is a chart that's taken from a forthcoming discussion paper by Jeff and co-authors, which shows the number of mentions of ECB speeches, the number of ECB speeches that mention consumer inflation expectations is the blue line, and you sort of see how this is going up a lot. The yellow bars are the number of central banks that have household inflation expectation survey, and you see this increasing a lot. So, you know, this is serious resources that are put into this question. And in line with this, you know, we see also a big uptick of the academic research. So that's a happy coincidence here. You know, both practitioners and academics are interested in the same questions here. We obviously now, with these survey tools that we have available, and we've seen many papers here at this conference today and yesterday, you know, we can generate a lot of research. So I think that is very helpful. So we are clearly on a rising trend here, and I think that's important. I mentioned, you know, how different the audience is here compared to financial markets. And I want to, and take up two pictures here to sort of illustrate this. This chart has been here up in the room before the coffee break. So Jeff presented a paper which shows the results from an ECB survey that was conducted after the ECB strategy review, where we asked people, you know, have you heard about the ECB in the 2 months after the big announcement was made that changed the ECB's inflation target? Turns out that 50% of respondents sort of said they have not heard about the ECB. And of those other 50% that have said that they have heard about the ECB, actually a large chunk of them actually didn't remember what they heard. So it seems hard to reach the general public. And something else that this chart illustrates here is that if we reach the general public, we typically do this through intermediated channels. So it's still a lot the traditional media, television, radio, newspapers are sort of the prime channels by which people hear about the ECB. So difficult to reach. Another thing that makes this much more complex is also it's a much more heterogeneous audience. And I want to put up a picture here that Alena will recognize, which is taken, well, it's based on our paper. It's actually not taken from our paper because we developed that picture only after the paper was already accepted in the journal. So here's finally a chance to put this up again. So what this shows is ECB tweets about the ECB. And we are measuring the strength of views that get expressed in these tweets on the x-axis and the subjectivity of those tweets on the y-axis. And you see the blue dots, which are tweets by non-experts. And you see the red dots, which are tweets by experts. And the whole idea of this chart here is to just illustrate how much more heterogeneity there is. Okay, so the people we use to talk to are those people in red here. So very factual, very homogeneous in terms of how they talk about the ECB. Reaching out to the general public is a whole different game here. So that's sort of what I tried to illustrate with that chart. So based on that, here's a couple of things I wanted to raise, to bring into the discussion. You know, where should we go forward with this research? We've seen a lot of papers that use RCTs over the last 2 days. I think, you know, this is great research, and I'm in the glass house here because, you know, the last paper was presented, I was part of that. It's a very important tool, but I think we really need to think hard about what do we take from these RCTs and how do we apply this to real life communications. So RCTs imply that we sort of, you know, put the central bank communication under the nose of our respondents here, and they have a much higher likelihood to read what central banks want to communicate than out there in the real life. And actually, I thought Mathieu's paper was very nicely showing that even in those RCTs, many people actually don't read the central bank communication. So, you know, imagine what this is like out there in real life. They have no desire, they don't come across these things. They would need to make an active effort to search for that. So how do we actually take all of this evidence out to the real life world? What are the policy implications of this? I think it's really something we need to think about more. Now, we've also seen that RCTs, you know, are very successful in affecting people's inflation expectations. So Michael Lamler had a paper on this, Laura had a paper on this. I think that raises another question, which is my second point here. what should central banks actually communicate about and what not? So, these RCTs are great. They show, we can move inflation expectations. Well, we can, but should we? I think that's a normative question that we also need to consider in our research. Central banks' own inflation forecasts are uncertain, and they are not always very good. And they might actually not be better than the inflation expectations of households. So do we really want to communicate our inflation expectations, our central bank forecasts, to the general public and bring the inflation expectations down? Maybe, there was a lot of value added in the original signal. And do we really think, we should steer agents' inflation expectations through these type of information treatments? I would sort of say, maybe we want to be humble. There's one thing we're reasonably certain about, that is the central bank's inflation target, that you can probably safely communicate about. And, Alexis had a paper on this, which uses this type of information treatment. That's also very helpful. I think it implies central banks will be more humble. I think it also might have an advantage that we can actually still use the signal that the communication, the consumer inflation expectations actually provide to the central bank. Again, there's a literature on financial markets. Yun Shin has worked on that, how you actually sort of distort a signal that you might take from financial markets. And I think the same applies here to consumer inflation expectations, which again brings me to the third point. I think we should take consumer expectations seriously. Traditionally, when central banks do this inflation expectation survey, they try to report, or typically report, the median. So they basically disregard the distribution around the median. Also, in many of our papers, we windsorize or we take out sort of the tails of the distribution. I think there's research going on right now which tries to overcome this. So Francesca Monti has a paper on this, Michael Weber with Francesco D'Acunto, Guido Ascari is working on this as well, where they take the entire distribution of consumer inflation expectations, and they actually see that there is a lot of value added information signals that I think are useful for the central bank to take. Fourth point, high frequency observations on consumers. That's what I mentioned early on. Central banks, the communication with financial markets is easy because we have very high frequency observations, so we can see exactly how the communication lands with financial markets. This is much harder for consumers. There is now attempts to overcome this. So Davide and the work with Alena, we have these Twitter data, which I think are a high frequency way to look at how consumers perceive communication. I was glad to hear that we now have daily inflation expectation survey at the Cleveland Fed. So again, there's ways to do this, and I think this is still something we need to think about harder. How can we get high frequency observations that allow for causal identification outside RCTs? Next question, how to get through to consumers? We know it's hard. Often we find in these papers that in the RCTs, we actually have bigger effects on those who are already converted. So the last paper by Jeff showed that those who are already financially literate are actually taking more out of an information treatment than the less financially literate. So how do we get through to those people where the benefit might actually be largest? I think, again, that's a question we need to think more about. Again, think about the channels. We've had the paper by Alena on the role of the messenger, the role of media. Peter and Shu had these papers here. So that's various ways of thinking at this. And the other big question in this literature, I think, is, again, this notion of how complex do we want the message to be? So the consensus seems to be keep it simple. We've heard 2 papers on this today. Is there a risk of oversimplifying? Again, this is a question I think we want to take very seriously in this literature. 2 more points, role of trust. Again, we've seen papers on this over the last 2 days. We all understand trust is very important. It's not so clear how we want to measure that. There's various questions we can ask people. Muhammad had a different way of doing this, Alexis as well. So again, we want to understand better what these different concepts of trust actually measure, how they correlate, which ones is more useful for our purposes. And I think we should also think more about how do central banks gain trust? how do they lose trust, and how can they regain trust once they have lost trust? And unfortunately, the recent episode might actually be a fertile ground for looking into this. We have papers on what if central banks have done relatively poor inflation forecasts? What does this do for the credibility? So Michael and Ryan have worked on this. Muhammad has a paper on this. Forward guidance. So Peter's paper talked about the forward guidance experience in Australia and how that affected credibility and trust. We've had a period of high inflation. And what Claudiana brought already up, there's multiple objectives. How does that affect trust and credibility? So again, a whole bunch of questions I think would be interested. And last question, where should actually central banks invest resources? Let's keep in mind central bank communication is costly. It requires a lot of people to write speeches, to put out this information. It's also costly on the receiving end to process all of this information. So we want to think about, where are these resources best invested? Question again, can there be too much communication? Can we also start putting the various results that we have in the literature into perspective? So we run all these individual papers and we show here's a great information treatment. Well, we need to start putting these things into perspective. Which ones actually work better? Which give the best value added? Again, also thinking about the different target groups, where can we actually sort of really improve people's understanding, which also brings me on this role of financial education. To what extent should central banks embark on that? And this is a very, very long questions, and I would leave it at this. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Let me see if I can do this now for myself. Where did I put it? Okay, go back. Go here. You share. Okay, and now I'll go control. Okay. What's that? Yeah, you need to. So I need to stop sharing, exactly what I just told Michael and Claudiana to do. And then I have to go back to here. And then I go share screen, window, that one. Sure. Okay, good. We're here. Okay, I'm going to talk just very briefly, actually, about a topic which we didn't hear very much about today or yesterday, but I still think deserves some attention in this literature. And I will give you the 30-second version of the origin story of how I ended up working on central bank communication. And the answer is, I didn't care about central bank communication. What actually happened was I cared about how central bankers made decisions. And so this sort of first slide was what got me into it. I was thinking about committees, so a string of work with Stephen Hansen, and we were looking at particularly the decisions as reflected in votes. And so I have a couple of 3 papers that really take seriously voting models and how they vote and all of this. And then, at one point I realized that actually we were reducing the entire Monetary Policy Committee's behavior, which in some cases involves 2 days of deliberation, into a one-dimensional vote for or against a proposition made by the Governor of the Bank of England at the time. So 2 days of talk, 1 summary statistic. And someone who then went on to serve on a couple of MPCs, Silvana Tenreiro, asked a question which is, well, what about the deliberation? What about idea generation? And so I actually got into this because I was interested in who generates ideas. And it sort of builds directly from this work with Stephen. Monetary policy committees sort of seem to accumulate information, and we know, and Claudiana was sort of referring to this, that we know when the market finds out about a dispersion of views or dissents, as Paul was talking about at the very start of the conference, which sort of feels like ages ago now, these things matter for markets and they take information from it. But you could actually look within the committees themselves, or at least within some committees, and explore where those dissents come from. Why do they come about? What are the reasons? You know, who dissents? Do we have policymakers who we could refer to as like the kind of stopped clock? You know, they'll dissent no matter what, and they'll dissent in the same direction. Nobody's really going to care about that. What people really care about is the sort of weather vane type members who could go up, could go down. People who Claudiana colorfully refers to in her paper as neither hawks nor doves, but swingers. So I think, you know, that's it. And so the first paper that we actually wrote on the communication within, so we'd been working within committees, was this paper on transparency. And again, this is not a question about central bank communication with the outside world per se, but it's a question about if the sort of efficacy of an MPC is to, you know, aggregate information, and central banks make an institutional decision to open the windows to the world, like in here, rather than having the sort of curtains down, smoke-filled rooms. In, you know, the 70s, they were literal smoke-filled rooms, but, you know, now they're just these opaque rooms that nobody could get a look into. Does that change the way policymakers behave and the decisions they make? And so that was this sort of first paper that we started looking at. And, you know, this is ancient history now, right? This is 10 years ago. But, you know, even when we wrote this paper first, the Fed, by an accident of history, made available transcripts. At the time, the Bank of England made available minutes, but destroyed all possible knowledge of transcripts, you know, reformatting every computer that had been used to write the minutes so that there'd be nothing apart from what went out. And then the ECB was at the time neither providing minutes nor transcripts. And there's some ECB people in the room, so I'm going to admit I'm a little unfair with my ex here, because there was a promise to release it after 30 years. But in the world of even the research on that, 30-year lag is quite a long time. But since then, you know, in 2014, a lot of things changed. The ECB now releases these accounts of the meeting, so we've changed on that. The Bank of England now releases not quite verbatim transcripts, but things that look like transcripts, full discussions of the meeting. And we have the first year of it. So you can now, if you're interested, you can study that. But that's what sort of got me into it. It's also what got me into all of the NLP type literature of, well, because once you start studying ideas and studying communication and words, you're sort of faced with a problem. If you've been classically trained in the statistical techniques like I was, it's like you're used to rectangular data with a nice time, maybe a panel dimension. Excellent, we can handle that. But then you get transcripts, and sometimes they're 70 pages, sometimes they're 50. One person says 2 words in their interjection, another person talks for 25 minutes. You suddenly have to start to learn to use new techniques. And you know, I came into this completely raw, as did Stephen. And, you know, it's been a really fun, I can still remember 2012 was when we started working on it, and the paper actually got published in 2018. So for economics, that's not bad when we had to learn an entire new area of stuff. What's really amazing about this, though, and we sort of bit with the Jules paper earlier, which is, you know, what the stuff we did that was kind of frontier and a bit radical at the time. Like I used to give seminars and people were like, what is this magic you're doing with these techniques? Now these are completely standard. And some of that is just cohort effects, like the younger people, of which there are many in the room. You know, you guys now learn this as you go through university, or people take data science courses. I still remember the Chicago Fed was where this dawned on me. Chicago Fed is a wonderful group of economists. All the economists and senior economists and advisors were like, what is this magic you're doing with the words and getting stuff out? And everybody who was the RAs, or the sort of the equivalent of the pre-doc, the Fed pre-doc type program, had all just come out of undergrads in the US, had all taken a number of computer science courses and were asking questions like, can I just check about the tuning of the Dirichlet hyperparameter? Did you use this? And the other people in the room were like, what's going on? How do you all know this language? It's just become very traditional. So I think that's good. I'm going to say a few words at the end about where we may not want to go. I'll give you another way in which it's good. So one of the questions that sort of came up from Claudiana's presentation was, you know, what information is being communicated? Why are they making decisions? Like, what's the gaps? Well, actually, so one nice thing about this is you, like with transcripts, which the Fed have and the Bank of England has, or even with things like minutes, you can get a bit of this, or by even using speeches, you can think about what are the things that different policymakers say are driving their decision. And so this particular work, this work with Stephen and Song Zhao and Anna Chislak, we really try to look at policymakers often talk about, we think about the world in a risk management framework. This is very different, by the way, to our standard Taylor rule, which has fixed coefficients and just moves around. But again, for closing a model, Taylor rule, perfectly fine, perfectly great. But if you really want to understand what makes them diverge from what we think they would do, what causes surprises, you can look inside the meetings and see how they discuss things. You know, there's lots of theories we have on this, some more prevalent than others in the modeling world. But what we show in this paper, and this is just some extracted measures of policymakers' own expressed uncertainty about inflation and the economy, and you can then look how much that seems to drive their actual decision-making and their policy positions. And one thing that jumps out of it, which was not at all obvious to me, was that actually the inflation stuff is one of the things that policymakers, this is based on the Fed, over about, Greenspan start 1987 up until when you can continue it now to 2018 when we have the transcripts. So over that period, there are lots of times, including, and maybe surprisingly including, right around the financial crisis. Concerns about inflation went up, then they dropped. But then as soon as QE started, they started to worry that inflation was coming back because you've just released all this money into the system. What's going to happen? And this really seems to drive, and we show now in subsequent work with that they communicate this externally and that moves markets. So looking inside is a great way, even if what you want to understand is outside. The other thing I think that I sort of bang on about this a lot is because I used to be a central banker and I sort of remember my days inside, and then I think back to how we model these things. Like we talk a lot about what's the source of market surprises. Well, this is my stylized model of how monetary policy decision-making actually happens. And it's quite different to the world we have in full information, rational expectations models. You know, central bankers get a whole host of data. Anyone who's worked at the Bank of England will remember the famous chart pack, which is just a thick wedge of pages with lots of charts and tables on it. But you get all of that. And from that, you're supposed to extract essentially some kind of signals about the state of the world. That's the omega CB on that chart. Now, the thing about this is that mapping is not fixed. There's not like some rule that if industrial production goes up above some gap level, that we automatically think the world is this much better. It's the combination of all of these noisy indicators that get you to some heuristic view of what the economy is looking like. And then based on that, and maybe the uncertainty and some other things, you sort of choose what interest rate to implement. Now, this is just a sort of stylized thing of your nesting functions. But once you do that, you realize that actually thinking about the world as these fixed parameter reaction functions becomes nearly impossible. So actually the job of communication in a full information rational expectations model is much easier because you just go out to the world, you tell them what your inflation target is and what your coefficients are, and you commit to those and you're done. Communication is over. They see all the shocks, they see all the movements, they see everything. And yet we know from what Michael just told us, they barely pay it in the real world, they barely pay attention to everything. And we can extrapolate from what Claudiana told us that even the markets are sort of looking to the central bank for guidance on what they think is happening. And I do not believe that this is because we all ascribe sort of genius status to every central bank. I think they have information processing abilities that may be superior. But I think in general, it's just trying to figure out what are the shocks, and everybody's trying to do this job. And I think looking inside the meetings, you can do that. I'll skip that one. I'm going to end on this slide, but I just say a few things. You know, I think the one, so I've started doing work with sort of here in Oxford with some like computer scientists, engineers, linguists, looking at how you measure narrative. And it's a really interesting topic and it's a really difficult thing to do. But the sort of takeaway I have from it is that sort of put me now working much more in the genuine natural language processing literature. And there are some bits of that I think we need to adopt. So Alina, you mentioned it yesterday. Max Ahrens and I have a paper that tries to do this, where we need to adopt some of their techniques, which include like benchmarking our measures. And I'm as guilty as everybody else. You know, you come up with your preferred measure, you go, oh, look, it's got some external validity, like mine goes up, the interest rate goes up, mine goes down, the interest rate goes down. Great. The way an NLP researcher would do it is they'd have something coded as some hard truth. It may be hand coded by someone else or whatever. And then you would see which combination of these data characteristics of the text best combine to give that. And they would then use that as a kind of best fit model. Now, they have a different focus to us. We're really focused on causality. They're more focused on fit and out of sample prediction. But I still think we can benefit a bit by sort of using their techniques, but also using them a little bit more similarly to how they use them. But equally, and I'll say this as my closing comment on methodology, and then I'll sit down and we can take questions. I think economists have a preference for transparency over marginal gains in macro F1 score fit. If you don't know what a macro F1 score fit is, it means you have not been reading NLP literature in the last 20 years. This is essentially a metric of how well your model fits the out of sample data versus some other model. And this is what is really the key in those papers. And what do I mean by that statement? I mean, if you stand up and give a kind of pure black box NLP methodology, and I'm including in this large language models, which can be fantastic, and it's amazing what they can do, but it's also amazing what mistakes they can make. And it's also amazingly difficult to figure out exactly what's driving things. The same is also true for any of these sort of transponder neural network encoding type models, BERT, FinBERT, FinBERT2, central bank BERT, BERT and Ernie, whatever. Okay, there is actually something called Ernie, so somebody already got that joke. But so I really think that there are advantages sometimes to simplicity in economics. Certainly, like you're not going to publish in a top NLP journal with the pure dictionary method and nothing else, but at least they're very transparent. Now, there's some happy middle ground where you choose that dictionary in a way that's optimized, that's not just you going, well, I tried 150 dictionaries and this one gave me the results I wanted. We've got to avoid that. But I do think in general, our profession is still sort of on a path that favors the simplicity over something completely complex. But that's a personal opinion. Let's sit down and take some questions, and I'm going to stop this share so that we can all be sitting at the table. So stop share. Okay, right, I'm going to bring this mic back. And we're going to open to questions. There's one in from the internet. But why is that? I don't want that. Let's pin us. And Refet is there as well. Okay, I'm going to, just because you guys are in the room, I'm going to have the first question go to the room. And then I'll go to Caroline, who's asked a question in the Q&A. If anyone else has a question, just please put it in the Q&A. And Refet, if you want to react, actually, Refet, you're kind of the CEPR boss now, so I better let you react first if you want to. No? Good. Okay. Anyone in the room have any comments or questions? Oh, I had one last thing that I should have reacted to this. I think one other thing that we can do, and I say this because it sort of relates to what you're talking about, the public, and how one thing I take away from some of the papers we've seen is how important with the getting through question the media is. And I think one thing we can do more is work with journalists, former journalists, or current journalists, or you really want to understand like what messages they're seeking, what information they're lacking, what they're really thinking. I think journalists are one way to also do it. So that's another push. Just chucking ideas out there. Are there any questions in the room? Or you guys were asking loads of questions when the cameras weren't on. Couldn't. Okay, then I'm going to go to Caroline's question. Okay.
If I may add one thing, convention journalists, and there were a lot of papers on media and the media role and all that. I think when we started this exercise a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, with our meeting at the ECB in Frankfurt, the original attempt was to involve some media people. And I think there were a few, I may be the only one left, even though I'm now an ex-journalist, but I think there were a few at the time. I think would be helpful. I mean, a workshop like this may be a bit too academic for the consumption of the average journalist, even the ECB watcher, but it would not be, I mean, it would be useful, I think, to involve some media people in the follow-up of this exercise. And the other thing, which I think I mentioned before with some of you, is also, as was the original intention, to involve, I know the difficulties that this entails, to involve some either policymakers or former policymakers, which may have a bit more time than present policymakers, because they will also be or have been at the forefront of the deliberating process that you were mentioning. And so I think they will open a different angle to a lot of the things that were very interesting that were raised in these 2 days, but they would probably provide, I mean, they also are economists, but they also had this policymaking experience. And I think the contribution of both journalists and policymakers, former policymakers, whatever, I think would be essential to have a more complete development of this exercise of this group.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to ask actually, I was just about to mention that one of the people who's most involved is Athanasios Orphanides, and he's just asked a question. Okay, I'm gonna read out the 3 questions that we have, and then we'll take turns to answer them. I'll leave them on screen so that you can read them. But so, okay,
Too small.
okay. So Caroline Bentham says, given that reactions to central bank communications are more like heuristics and narratives than modelable functions, should we be talking to sociologists and linguists much more? I vote yes. Well, actually, I alluded to it. So I am, Caroline, you'll be glad to know. I have a project called it's called the Narrative Lab, and we've been working with these people, not just in monetary policy, actually, in every domain, rumor detection, conspiracy theory identification, how you can sort of track and evaluate narratives. So I think that's a good idea. Like I say, I view that as one part. It's more like that's the part that is the methodological part. I think we can, with those people, we can really develop the tools to study the narrative. But I do think that when we sit down to understand how those narratives affect economic variables, we have our own tools and our own sort of causal inference devices that I think are quite useful. But that's my response. I'll let the others answer in a second. We have Samantha Ching, who says, since central bank communication is costly, should central banks just focus on engaging and addressing the inflation expectations of experts and select segments of the general public, i.e. heads of households? And then Athanasios Orphanides says, can we examine if much of what has been added over the past 10 to 20 years by central banks is noise? Is this helping clarify the reaction function or obscure it? Well, since I answered the first question, I'm going to let one of you two answer that one. Or people in the room can add their view if they also wish. Are central banks now just adding noise? And should they bother even communicating with the general public?
I think you should take that question, because I think one area where this is the biggest risk is probably if we think about, how do committee members themselves communicate, right? I would sort of say we've made a lot of progress in improving the signal to noise ratio in communication by committees. Again, there have been attempts to reduce the complexity and everything. So there's an effort to optimize this, but I would sort of argue, there's a lot more signal now than there used to be, and progress is still being made on this. I think the risk that is out there is to what extent can central banks sort of generate cacophony of voices, which then generate a lot of noise. So this is really about how do the committee members themselves, as opposed to the committee talk. And maybe if I could get also to the second question, I think we should not sort of think we can really target very specific subsets of audiences. So I'm sure all the efforts of central banks that go towards the general public are also observed by financial market participants. So, you know, if there's an Instagram video that a central bank puts out, I'm sure, you know, there's also central bank watchers that look at this. So it's going to be really, really difficult to, you know, tailor make communications to specific target groups. Again, I think what you want to think about is, you know, what messages are useful to target groups that could benefit more from that. Like, for example, those who actually start with a very low level of knowledge about central banking matters. Is this something where we should invest more? So it's really about the choice of topic, I would argue, rather than the choice of channel primarily.
So let me ask one thing on top of that. I mean, one thing that I think comes out here, and it's come out in previous work I've done, and most people in this room who've done work on this will have found it, that one of the big drivers of message reception, propensity to receive messages, how the message lands, so not just like, do they get it or not, like how they react to it, can be driven by levels of financial literacy or expertise in this. How much should central bank, and most central banks do, by the way, but how much should they invest in the educational part, and how much do we have to rely on the wider economic education curriculum? I mean, it's hard, right? The central bank doesn't set the curriculum for anything, but they produce nice resources.
I think this is, so there's a very heterogeneous approach to how central banks are doing this. You know, some central banks have actually a more direct mandate to embark on that, and then they have a much more active role. I think even central banks that don't have a mandated active role in this try to develop material that can be used in education. So there's a lot of material out there for school teachers that can be used now. How to make sure that this is being picked up, I think, is a difficult question.
Yeah. Do you want to pick up any of those?
Yeah, so I'd like to pick the question on the, let's say, the noise with reaction function. I think that we had a big improvement over the years of coming with clear objectives on inflation, and by having a clear target and at what over which time horizon we're going to achieve that, it kind of restrict the paths, the different paths for or different reaction functions. If we have committees with different preferences, of course, if they don't have one objective, they might want to arrive at a certain number at a different speed. And this clear objective kind of made this reaction function a bit more clear over time. But by adding more objectives, I think we are going to be more uncertain about the reaction function. For example, financial stability. When ECB announced with the new strategy that they will take financial stability consideration in account when conducting monetary policy, they say that we're not going to have let's say a setup rule now, but we'll be flexible in the approach. And I think this is the case that is that noise, maybe that is not noise, but is a new reaction function that we will learn over time.
So I'm going to add one thing on that, which is, you know, I think this cacophony of voices thing is interesting because, you know, I think sometimes it's unrealistic when you see a committee of, let's even take a small committee like the Bank of England, 9 people. 9 people all fully agree on one path or one decision. So the absence of cacophony sometimes to me is scarier. Like we should and then you hear them talk, and you know, like it becomes clear now. Claudiana, she thinks the output gap is much closer to neutral. You think we're actually in positive output gap territory, and yet you've voted for the same thing. So one of my friends and one sort of ECB Bank of England watcher, a guy called Richard Barwell, always asked the question, is there not enough disagreement? Because even the speeches tend to suggest they disagree a lot, but then when you look at the votes or you look at the the actual differences in path, they're pretty minor. Like, should we be expecting more? I don't know. That's a yes.
Can I get back to this? So I agree. I mean, this is the whole purpose of having a committee. You want diverse views on there. To me, the question is, how do you get these diverse views out to the public in a way that generates noise or in a way that generates a signal? And I'm not sure all central banks are doing a good job in this. So to me, I think the importance is to get these different views out in a structured way, not through leaks, for example. Right? We had a seminar on this a couple of months ago. So, how can you make sure that all the different views are on the table and are also communicated, so the central bank watchers get a sense of the diversity of views on the committee, but they want the full view, and they don't want it piecemeal because there's a speech today and another speech tomorrow. Can you convey this in a systematic manner that gives sort of a good overview of what's been discussed?
So there used to be certain people of a certain age in the room will remember this. The Bank of England inflation report used to contain a table that actually had disagreements on some of the assumptions and their implication for the forecast numbers. So the Bank of England forecast is the committee's forecast. It's not the staff's, it's the committee's, and it's the best collective judgment of the committee. But, best collective judgment. You could disagree with the fact that we think the import price pass-through will be 0.8 and you think it should be 0.4, and this makes a huge difference. So you could put that in. There's a little line on these tables, and each one was put in. Well, I guess the question is whether that is full enough, right? That's very technical. That's a very geeky way of getting it across, and whether maybe some of these speeches, and I'm sympathetic to Athanasius's point about whether these things create news or noise, and the fact that they could introduce some news. But we had a discussion earlier, which I thought is a very useful one, which is, this is sort of in reaction to Martin's question to Roxy's presentation, right? We can see some of these signals do create volatility, but attributing good or bad to volatility is very difficult, because you don't per se, maybe financial stability people do, and I'm just showing myself to be a monetary policy biased central bank type. But, you don't care per se that there's a bit of volatility that's higher today than it was, before my speech, or that, What I care about is that the economy looks like, these things are in the right place, and, we don't have the completely wrong expectations of particularly our own behavior. If I'm a policymaker, I can't be that concerned, or I can't do much if the markets choose to price earthquake risk at 10 times the order of magnitude that it is, because it's sort of but I think we should care a lot as policymakers if they start pricing in our behavior to be very different to what we think it is. And correcting that can be volatile, and I don't think central bankers should shy away from doing that. Claudiana, do you want to answer the question? Should we talk to the public? It's a fundamental question. You don't have to.
I mean, of course, we should talk to the public. There is this, how to say, it's the people we serve.
Yeah. Okay. No.
That's
right.
The mandate, in a sense, is for everybody, and it's important to explain the objective, what we do, and why we do, because we think their behavior is important for our transmission mechanisms.
Good. I agree. I wrote a paper on this with Andy Haldane years ago. It was like our manifesto for trying to do it. And I know some people don't agree. Okay, we have a few other questions coming in. To better communicate with experts or the general public, how can we utilize the research insights we have obtained so far in the real practice, such as writing monetary policy statements and speech drafts, especially beyond the general advice like using simple words or avoid jargon? That's one. Jonathan Benchamal has, don't you think that central banks integrated text analysis tools enough to use them before making public their communications? How could LLM models help analyze central bank communication better, in your opinion? And then, oh gosh, loads came in. I should have been paying more attention. Evangelos says, is there a helpful examination under the length of adding behavioral macroeconomic aspects? So I'll come to the next one's later, but that's 4 now, or 3 now that I think we can, well, there's 2 in Jonathan's question. How how do we incorporate these insights? Michael, you're at the coal face of policy. You know, I think back to your paper about starting from a blank page. That seemed to me like one where there was a direct potential impact on policy practice.
I think you know, we should take every paper and think about what are the policy implications of these papers. No, I mean, and this is what we try to do in central banks. So admittedly now off the cuff, I find it hard to come up with very concrete examples. But you know, again, these papers about clarity, again, you know, we have identification issues. You know, what is bad volatility, what is good volatility, but you know, these things should help to make us better understand how we design communication. So yeah, I'm not sure. You know, I don't have a very concrete example now to give how we can improve communication. There's so many people here in this room. You know, they should start taking over these difficult questions.
I'll answer Jonathan's too. So I think central banks absolutely can process. This was always my running joke that my objective was to be near the first of people who use these techniques, such that by the time they became mainstream and central banks were doing them and therefore invalidating their use, I would have already got my publications and got the heck out of there. It's a cheap first mover advantage. I don't think that does invalidate, because we can still, one advantage of these text mining techniques, and I was sort of thinking it, but maybe I didn't say it explicitly earlier, is a huge advantage is you can apply them backward in a consistent way. And therefore you can, you know, you can effectively interview with your techniques policymakers who are no longer in post and in many cases no longer with us. So like you can see, you know, we have this entire macro literature about indeterminacy and Volcker versus Burns, and you know what actually you can go back and try and look at what the discussions were like. Did they look like phi was less than 1 and then phi became greater than 1? So these are the types of things that you can do. So I think even if they do start passing all their speeches through this stuff, I think there will still be opportunities for research. And actually, whether it's NLP tools or just human time, Michael was alluding to it, and I always use this quote from Andy Haldane. Most central bank communication, including speeches, absolutely including minutes or official documents, and this was Andy's phrase, are drafted to within an inch of their life. By which I mean people who work in central banks spend many hours sitting around discussing whether or not we should say there is a significant weakness or a substantial weakness. And this is debated and discussed. And yet, despite that, these things can still get interpreted in different ways by the market. So I don't think the LLMs fix that or other things.
But I think Jonathan's question also points to something else. My understanding of this question was, we need to understand that the recipients of central bank communications often now are machines and not humans, right? So to what extent do we actually, you know, before we go external, do we actually try to run this through machines ourselves?
But machines are like humans. There are many variants of them, and they interpret the same words in different ways.
Right.
So that's the sense in which I think you can pass it through hundreds of these models and then still find that when you send it out, the reaction is completely different. So that LLMs, I'm not against LLMs. I think the opacity of them can be difficult to work with. Obviously, in the NLP literature, you know, moving towards transparent, open access LLMs is what they are doing. So they do not per se like the ChatGPTs, where you don't know exactly what they're trained on, you don't know when they were last trained, and you know that they're going to change next week. So if I plug the same text in, it might come out with something different. But there are many other versions like Llama and other ones that people have put out where you can really see what's in them, and then and they make them. But they're also, you know, they're not, ChatGPT is a nice user interface to work with. If you want to work with the sort of 70 billion parameter version of Llama, you need some pretty serious computing technology around. It's not necessarily for the faint-hearted. But anyway, I realize we haven't answered the last question, which is about is there a helpful examination under the length of adding behavioral macroeconomic aspects. So I guess it's a question about behavioral macro. I'm looking at you.
So, I guess we have to define what is behavioral macro.
Fine.
If we think about behavioral aspects of, let's say, one problem that we discuss these days is how to attract the attention of the general public. They are not so interested on monetary policy, and I think from the behavioral economics or this literature is the idea of nudging. So, do we want to nudge the general public to pay attention to our communication? And I think related with the question before, if you look now at the websites of central banks, they're full of visuals, videos, short sentence. So this is one way to if they happen to come to our websites, I think they will grab more easily some of the important information that we want them to see straight away, the interest rate, the inflation, what is inflation, and why we took the decisions. But I think there is room to use behavioral, let's say, economics tools to attract the public, but I think it's expensive as well.
I think by definition, a lot of the research we saw over the last 2 days had some implied behavioral stuff going on. In some of the models, it was very explicit. You say, no, this is how they learn, or this is how they process information, or this is the limited information they have. I think communication in the fully rational, full information models is actually not as interesting as it is in all the other ones. Now, I think one place where there is a question, and maybe we'll never get a full answer to this because there's multiple models at work, but I do wonder whether part of why this literature is still, it's not a fully defined, this is the answer type literature, is because, some of the behavioral assumptions are about information processing, right? We've lots of models of rational inattention, theoretical, and then, implied empirical estimations of such. Others are about just differential processing, not differential attention that comes from some other place. Some of them are, literal private information that you can choose to release. I think these are all inherently behavioral, but yeah, we're sort of moving with these things side by side. And I'm not doing this, I'm not trying to rag on rational expectations and say, so I think when we write down models, when we're interested in general equilibrium effects of monetary policy, I still think they're the best benchmark we have. But when you're thinking about communicating, maybe we have to take some of those things more seriously.
And the other area, and again, this was your assigned topic, committee behavior. So this is, again, behavioral questions. How do committee members communicate to one another? How do they take decisions? So I think this is an area where we're already incorporating behavioral questions to this literature.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few more questions. Oh, one in the room. Martin, you're going to have to shout because you're right at the back of the room.
So there's not been any talk here about communication with one particular body that I'm interested in, academics. And it's not that I want the central bank to communicate its policy decisions or the uncertainty, but I would like to understand where the central bank has its greatest uncertainties of understanding of the economy, where the central bank would like academics to be able to do things that are useful and contributing. Now, I know the Bank of England announces a set of research priorities. Given that we've got two senior central bankers here and Michael is a Michael banker, I wonder, have you reflected on whether you think your communication and the way you're interacting with academics is optimal, or whether there is things that could be improved there?
No, I think that's a great question. I think this is something that central banks do think a lot about. I mean, I would also argue that a lot of the progress that has been made in monetary policy sort of has been, coinciding or originating from academic research, right? So I think, there's a very close interlinkage between the practice of monetary policy and academic research. I think, the fact that central banks run conferences, have fellowships, bring in academics to seminars, I think it's probably unparalleled to other public administration bodies. So a lot of resources are spent into this communication, and I think because it's seen as extremely valuable both ways, right? I mean, we also have these prizes or again fellowships where we try to sort of nudge research into topics, right? We want to make topics, there's a lot of bright brains out there in academia, and if we can make sure that these work on topics that are of relevance to central banks, right, this is going to be extremely helpful. So I think this is an ongoing communication that we have. Now, whether this is being optimized, I don't know. Again, it would be good to take the view of the academics on that as well. But it's clearly something we're putting in a lot of resources and a lot of thought.
Fabiana, you get to answer if you want, or you can pick one of the other questions. Sorry, I was just trying to fix something in technicality.
I totally agree with Michael. And actually, when we started to do this communication with the general public, one thing that we were noticing is that policymakers are communicating a lot. Many of these events that we're saying, more than 150 events per year, actually they are happening with the academia. So most of this communication is in conferences. And so it is discussions, or always there is a speech in a conference. So there is a communication with academia, so that's there. But there is also this invitation through seminars, but also evaluation. So very often academics are invited to evaluate either the forecasting, let's say, exercises central banks have, or the research output and providing a more strategic, let's say, framework for the future. So I think this is very important.
Okay, we usually stop at 15:15, but this is going well, so I'm going to give a few extra minutes. Hold on. Could you give an example of when the central bank had to adjust its communication in response to unexpected economic events? How is this managed? Do political events such as elections or changes in government leadership impact tone, content, timing of central bank communication? If so, how? In order to reach the general public, shouldn't central banks use unorthodox methods such as the ones that the Bank of Jamaica does, reggae songs, concerts, or any non-standard way? And monetary policy is designed for normal time. Uncertainty, however, is a fact of life. Do you think it's better to improve nowcasting to minimize risk management? I'm going to start flying through these and you guys can jump in where you want. On the last one, uncertainty is a way of life. And I think because of that, even if you improve nowcasting to be the best possible nowcasting in the world ever, there'll still be a bunch of things that nobody saw coming and you're going to have to deal with them. And that's life. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do risk management, because risk management is about when, bad things happen. On the real side, I think of central banks as risk managing by putting a floor on how bad the real events might get. And on the upside, when inflation takes off, or it looks like it might take off, they put some ceiling on how far they would let it go. And I think these are really important ways. And I think having that mentality of a kind of regime switching, like we just have to save the world right now. Like if you think about central banks in 2008-9, that's what they were doing. Even though some members of the FOMC, as I alluded to, started talking about inflation, that was not the predominant view. And they were thinking that's in the back of their mind, but we still have to save the world. Unorthodox methods, Marco's question. I've actually studied that because I think that is the coolest thing ever. And many of you have seen me present and show those videos and everything. The measured effects, as far as I can see, on inflation expectations in Jamaica are minuscule. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I'm in the old school world of, we should keep trying and we should get through and engagement is hard, but I'm not sure what works. TikTok.
Inflation expectation might not be the only outcome.
No, sure.
Awareness of the central bank might actually increase. Trust might increase.
And actually what you can see, because I haven't got the micro data, is you can see it on the mean. But if you bring the tails in, like you don't have anyone who thinks it'll be -10 or +25, and you bring everyone into sort of more normal range, maybe that's perfectly good. So I'm not saying it doesn't. I haven't done a full evaluation, but they were very cool. I want to see the Bundesbank's hard rock video, or I try to pick Irish Cayley music, explaining the benefits of flexible inflation targeting and a symmetric target around 2%. Then we'd have a different response to your survey, Jeff.
Does bring me back to this question, however, where do you want to spend resources, right?
Yeah, sure.
Again, right, is that the best? I mean, it might work, it might not work. We don't understand that yet, but then is it still sort of the best area where you want to spend your resources?
So my joke was always, if you really wanted to get through to people, like, let's just pay Taylor Swift whatever she charges for an Instagram post. It will get more eyeballs than anything else. Now, it's also going to cost you whatever. I don't know what she charges, probably stupid numbers like 500,000 per word or something. But anyway, there's my suggestion to central banks out there who want to run that experiment. If you do, give me a shout in advance. We can randomize things and do all sorts of fun.
But there was also this question, examples where central banks adjusted their communication in response to shocks. I think we see this all the time, effectively. I think we've seen a lot of adjustment in central bank communication. And, one example is sort of the area I was supposed to talk about, increased communication with the general public. I think this was happening at least partially in response to a shock, right? So global financial crisis hits, central banks do unconventional monetary policy, puts the central banks squarely into a public discourse, very controversial discussions. Central banks have sort of understood, that requires a change in the communication, and they took that challenge up. So there's now a lot more emphasis on communication with the general public. So this is just one example. I think there's many.
Any of those you want to pick up on?
No, probably I just want to add that we're speaking about role of communication, but not all communication is good communication. So we have also examples of, let's say, communication gone wrong, the taper tantrum, or this was for the Fed, but we have also cases for the ECB that I'm not going to mention. But so there is also, let's say, unwanted bad effects of communication, and that then the central bank has immediately intervened to undo these effects and improve.
Yeah, so I'll take the hit, and I'll do the political one. I think we do see some effects, like you often hear, and you see it from market watchers. So let me just convey the market watcher view. There's sort of talk even now this year, when there's a lot of political uncertainty in the world, asking questions like, if the Fed's going to do anything drastic, it kind of has to get it done by September, because it can't do anything to monetary policy between October and January. In the UK, we don't know when the election will be, but there's greater constraints, I think, on policymakers once an election is called, and what they would be willing to talk about. So it does affect a little bit. I still like the idea. I was having this chat with people earlier. I still like the idea that I think central bankers should not give advice on fiscal policy. I think that's the right thing to do, but they should talk about fiscal policy, right? I've taught, not this year as I'm on leave, but the previous 6 years, I was teaching first-year macro to undergrads here in Oxford. And one of the things we teach them is the effects of monetary policy depend strongly on fiscal. You have a paper on this, Claudiana. And, what's that? You're looking at, fiscal versus monetary. Yeah, no, but I mean, there's an interaction, right? These things matter. And yet, partly because we created independence, operational independence, a lot of central banks have become wary to say anything like, oh, actually, if you do a 1.9 trillion fiscal stimulus, that's going to change my outlook completely on what policy we'll have to do. And I maybe an open conversation. I think it happens in private. I think central bankers talk about this stuff all the time. Whether they talk about it publicly and whether they should, maybe that's a nice area for research. So I'm not sure, Jana, if that was what you were hoping to do. But if you have the paper, send it over. I'm interested to see it. I've gone to 20 past. I'm going to draw a line here, because I usually am very strict about my quarter past deadline, but this was too dynamic and interactive. I apologize if you asked a question and I did not get to you. Thank you to everybody in the room. I was really nervous beforehand, because I thought that most of the people who tune in were in the room. and then nobody would actually join the Zoom. But I can tell you that at its peak, 75 people were in the Zoom, and I'm adding 20 or so in the room. So that was a good outturn. So thank you to everyone for joining. Thanks for listening. Thanks for asking questions. Thanks to everyone in the room. Thanks for joining the conference if you were here. And hope everyone has a good time, and see you in a month. Okay, thanks everyone.